Hi, this is Jim Linnell. You know, I've been doing leatherwork for over 50 years now, and I've been teaching classes all over the place on behalf of Elk Track Studio. And of all of the classes that I've ever taught, there are none that are more important than what I'm going to show you right now. And that is, how do you get started in leatherwork? There are some basic techniques, some things that you need to learn, and if you learn those correctly, they will make a huge difference on how much enjoyment you get out of your leatherwork. So stay with me as I walk you through doing a pattern just like this, which will teach you how to use all of the most basic leatherworking tools. Now that we're all done with all of the stamping steps, there really is only one thing left to do, and that's a step called the decorative cuts or ornamental cuts. And if you look at a floral carving, a Western carving, quite often in all of these flowers like this and leaves even, they'll have some swivel knife cuts that are running in the midst of these leaves, and that's what comes next. So before I do that, though, I need to have a little more moisture. It needs to be a little bit, have a little bit more casing done to it before we actually do that step. So I'm going to come back and wet it one more time. And again, this is just that light coat of moisture on the surface of the leather. I'm not soaking it all the way through or anything like that. And then I'm going to let that dry just a little bit before I tackle it with my swivel knife. As our leather is starting to dry back to its original color here, I am going to, before I start cutting, I'm going to strop my knife again. This is one of the things that I would encourage you to make a habit early on. Every time you pick up this tool, you should strop it. That way you will never have a knife in your hands that's not ready to do the job you need it to do. So strop your knife a few times. And something else I'll point out about this stropping. I've done this a few times, as you know, over many years, but when I'm stropping, I'm pretty deliberate about making sure I keep the bevel of that blade flat on the surface of my strop as I bring it back, and I try to do equal number on both sides. I have seen folks kind of actually dull their blade by bringing their knife back and then rolling their hand up like this. So if you get into a habit of doing this, you're actually going to make your knife duller. So when you're doing this, you want to make sure that you're stropping it with straight strokes that come back and then pick it straight up. So anyway, it should be ready to go. So what are decorative cuts? Like I mentioned, they're cuts that fill in these designs, but there's nothing here to follow. I have no lines. I have nothing to guide me. So at this point, it's kind of up to me what I put in there. So let me explain what decorative cuts are and what's the purpose. Even though we've got some contour and some shape and texture in here, they still would look pretty plain if we left them like that. So decorative cuts are a way of dressing up these flower petals, and they need to follow the flow of the design. Remember, as we were doing the pear shading and such, we made sure that it was heavy out here and it all faded out and tapered toward the center of the flower. And even on these leaves out here, all of it kind of faded out as it went down the length and the flow of the stem work and so forth. Well, that's kind of what we want the decorative cuts to do as well. When I do the decorative cuts, I'm going to start out at the top. I'm going to have some heavy pressure there, but as I pull the knife toward me, I'm going to lighten up and fade it out, and you'll never see actually where I ended it. In fact, it looks like these cuts, in fact, when I do these, I'll do them in a group, but it looks like all of these cuts, if they were to go far enough toward the center of this flower, they would all eventually run together. But I lighten up on that pressure so that it fades out and disappears before they actually ever run one cut into another. So usually when we do this, we'll do them in a series like this, a group of cuts. And again, the goal here is to make them follow the flow of the design. We don't want to have these running in a direction that's contrary to the way the flower petals lay. So but how these actually get done, that's going to end up being a choice you get to make with every design you do. Usually if there's something like this, and you'll have this one to look at if you download this free pattern, but you'll have this to look at so you can get an idea of how I do it. But you'll find as you do your decorative cuts, you'll find that there's some that you can do better than others. And you will probably be able to just kind of do your own. But when you're first starting out, just learning how to make them add to your design and not detract from it is the key. Really important is this tapering out. When I put this cut the blade into the leather, I actually start out with a pretty good amount of pressure. I'm cutting and making that cut open up nice and wide, but then as I move toward where that's going to fade out, I start lightening up on that pressure so that the last probably 1/3 of the length of that cut, it keeps getting lighter and lighter and lighter until it fades out to nothing. And that's the secret to making them have a nice flow and to make sure that they add to your design. And they take practice. When you're first starting out, you probably cannot do enough cutting with this knife. And by that I mean, if this were just a practice piece, you got all this blank leather around here. If you've not been using that blank leather to try out all of your different tools and learn how hard to hit them and learn how to run your swivel knife and such, all of that, that's what you should be doing. The only way you ever get good doing any of this, it doesn't depend on how clever my video here might be. You have to learn how to do it yourself. You have to actually make these tools work for you, and that takes practice. You'll never get that unless you just sit down and do some leather work. And if there's nothing else you get from this video, it is that if you want to get good at this, it'll practice. Now hopefully it won't take you 50 years. Hopefully I've showed you a few things that I learned over those 50 years that have made this work easier and better for me. And like I said, I wish when I was getting started I'd have had somebody that would have sat down and said, okay, here's the things that you need to know. Here's the right way to handle the tools. Here's the way to hold the knife. Here, when I was first starting, I grew up on a ranch and I was like 50 miles from the nearest town. We would go there, once a month or something like that, and that's kind of where I fell in love with leatherworking. I saw these saddle makers, plying their trade. And when I got started at it, I had my swivel knife. I had a good swivel knife. There's nothing wrong with it. I sharpened the heck out of it, and I was trying as hard as I could, but boy, I could not make it glide through the leather. It just was sticking and jumping and dragging along, and I just didn't know what I was doing. And so one day I was at that saddle shop. We were stopped by to get something repaired or whatever, and I saw this old saddle maker reach down and grab a strop of leather, and he took his knife and he stropped it on leather. He rubbed it on there a couple times and then went back to cutting with the swivel knife. And I said, "What's that about?" And he said, "Well, son, you got to learn how to strop your knife. It ain't gonna work right if you don't strop it." I said, "Well, what is that?" And he gave me a little piece of jeweler's and he said, "You take this and you rub it onto a piece of leather or something, and then you run your knife over that. You strop it every once in a while when it starts to drag like that, and it'll work a lot better." Well, goodness gracious, I couldn't believe the difference that made. Well, I just wish somebody had told me that early on. I wish when I was first starting out, when I was getting inspired and going to give my leatherwork the first try, I wish somebody had been there to say, okay, here's the important things. Number one, you got to have your knife working good. Got to be stropped up, and it's got to be working well. I wish somebody had told me that. Sure would have saved me some frustration. I'd have found this a lot easier tool to use. The other thing, as you're doing your decorative cuts, is that let that swivel put those graceful turns into your cuts. If should not be wrestling that knife around the corners by shifting your whole arm or your wrist or whatever to try to make it give you those nice curving cuts. It's all done with letting the swivel do its job. So. And again, you can see, and I guess the point I hope you get is that it does not take a lot of tools. It does not take a huge investment to get into leatherworking. I mean, you can get, there's several companies that sell basic sets of tools, the stuff that you see me using. You can buy those usually grouped in a set pretty reasonably. And that's really all you need to get started. As you do more leatherwork, yeah, you'll probably find some things you want to add to that. I've over the years gathered up a lot of tools, but It's not that I need. In fact, people that look at the work that I do, they probably be surprised when they find out that I usually grab the same handful of tools almost all the time to do a lot of the work that I do. These same tools you see me using today, it doesn't take anything different than that. These right here are the important basics of leatherworking. And of all the classes that I've ever taught, learning these things right here is the most important thing that you could ever learn. Learning how to use these tools right, learning how to get these basic techniques ironed out early on so that you don't have bad habits that you have to break later, makes such a difference in your satisfaction that you're going to get out of leatherworking. One of the things you'll want to do as you approach to what you think is the end of your project here is to stop and look it over. Is there a leaf you missed some cuts on? Is there a background area you missed? Is there, double check it, because you want to make sure you get it completed. And with all of this, take whatever time it takes to do your best work. Learn how to use these tools smoothly. You don't see me trying to do these cuts at a fast pace. I'm doing each one of these very slow and very deliberate, making sure that it does exactly the cut that I want. And that's what you need to do. You need to work through it very deliberately and take your time with it. So, well, there you go. That right there is the basics of leatherwork. That right there, if you could do that with those 6 basic tools and that swivel knife, these tools right here, if you could use these tools and this swivel knife, I mean, you can carve saddles, you can do gun scabbards, briefcases, wallets, belts, whatever. You're not limited by the amount of leather work you can do by the number of tools you have. What does limit you is how much you know about how to use these tools. The techniques in making them do the job they were designed to do. So the last thing I would tell you, if you want to get good at this, you got to practice. Practice, practice, practice. But I hope you have as much fun with it as I've had. The final step with any project, once you've got it completed, once it's completely carved, we usually will put some kind of a protective finish on it. And that's to make it somewhat water resistant. There's a lot of things that are available, acrylics and so forth, that will do that. And so that would be the next thing to do with this. But before you do that, you always want to make sure your leather is completely dry, so that you don't have any residual moisture still in it. But let me show you. Here's one that I did recently, this same pattern, and this one has had a finish put on it. This has basically what we call an antique type of finish, which it's an acrylic finish. It did protect it and gave it a little bit of a gloss. You can probably see that, but it also helped to highlight the work that I did, and it settled in and gave the pear shading a bit darker shadows. It gave the decorative cuts, made them a little more prominent. It settled into the background areas and gave them a little more contrast. So these are some of the things that you can do to add even more dimension to your leather. But it doesn't have to have color to it, but it should have some kind of protective finish on when you're done. So that'd be the last thing that you would do to a project like this. So anyway, I hope you have a lot of fun with your leatherwork.